Someone is bombing a country's main international airport, while simultaneously telling reporters he has nothing but respect for the people doing the bombing and would, in fact, be honored to meet their leader. That is not a paraphrase. That is more or less the exact situation the United States finds itself in this week. Iran struck Kuwait City's international airport, set it ablaze, grounded all flights, killed at least one person, and wounded dozens more. It also hit Bahrain again, specifically the neighborhood housing the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet headquarters. And Trump, asked about it at the White House, suggested the ceasefire was still intact, that negotiations had gone very well, and said he would consider it an honor to sit down with Iran's supreme leader. You have to admire the consistency of that, in a way. Everything is fine. The airport is just doing its own thing. Let us establish what we are actually talking about, because ceasefire has been doing enormous heavy lifting in this conflict and deserves a closer examination. The U.S. and Iran agreed to a temporary ceasefire in April. It was brokered through Pakistan. It lasted in the sense that neither side officially declared it over, even as both sides continued trading missile and drone fire across the Gulf. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told reporters that the war with Iran is, quote, over. This was during a week when the United States struck Qeshm Island and Iran responded by hitting Kuwait and Bahrain. When does a ceasefire become a description of an ongoing war? Apparently right around the point where both sides find it politically useful to call it one. What is actually happening is this. The U.S. imposed a naval blockade of Iranian ports after ceasefire negotiations stalled. Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, or at least it did, using missiles and drones to keep most shipping out, while letting its own oil exports through. The Americans then tightened the screws, targeting Iranian vessels in a way that began to seriously cut into oil revenues. According to shipping data from Kepler, Iran had been exporting around 1.7 to 1.8 million barrels per day through March and April. The U.S. blockade sharply changed that. As of this week, analysts estimate the blockade has cost Iran nearly $6 billion in oil revenues since it began. The rial has collapsed to around 1.32 million per dollar. The IMF is projecting Iran's economy will shrink by 6.1% this year, with inflation at nearly 69%. That is the context in which the escalation this week happened. Not chaos. Calculation. Here is the thing about the strikes on Kuwait and Bahrain that the cable news coverage mostly missed, because cable news coverage tends to treat every new explosion as a fresh surprise, regardless of what preceded it. Iran did not escalate because it lost control of the situation. Iran escalated because it concluded that the existing level of conflict was comfortable for the United States and deeply uncomfortable for Iran. The blockade was tightening. Time was running out. Every week that passed without a deal was a week of declining oil revenues, worsening inflation, and growing economic pressure. And the Iranians looked at the skirmish level they had been operating at, drone for drone, strike for strike, a kind of choreographed low-intensity exchange. And they noticed that the Americans could sustain that indefinitely. The U.S. Navy does not run out of money when it intercepts Iranian drones. Iran's economy does bleed, slowly and steadily, every day the blockade holds. So the Iranians decided to change the pain calculation. They struck Kuwait, they struck Bahrain, they hit the U.S. Fifth Fleet's home base. They said explicitly that they were no longer responding proportionately, that every U.S. strike would be met with 1.5 times the force in return. The actual ratio, by most outside estimates, was considerably higher than 1.5. It was closer to 5. The point was not to win a military exchange. The point was to demonstrate that the low-level status quo was not, in fact, low-level anymore. That if the U.S. wanted to keep pressing the blockade, the pain would now spread. Kuwait's airport on fire spreads pain. Bahrain's neighborhood in flames spreads pain. A global oil market already described by the International Energy Agency as experiencing the largest supply disruption in the history of global oil markets. That spreads pain everywhere. And then Trump played it down. He suggested Iran was reciprocating. He called the attacks limited. He did not order immediate major retaliation, which is, if you watch how Trump actually operates in this conflict, rather than how he talks about it, exactly what you would expect. Trump has now twice confirmed to reporters that he would be willing to meet Iran's supreme leader. The new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who has not appeared in public since early in the conflict and is believed to have been severely injured. Trump said he would be honored. He said Khamenei probably has a good reputation in some circles. He added carefully that he had not said he wanted to meet him, but that if a deal were reached, he would be okay with it. This is not sloppy language. Trump is extremely deliberate about which things he says on the record in front of reporters versus which things he says on Truth Social when he is actually angry. He called the attacks on Kuwait limited. He has not posted a single furious ultimatum this week demanding Iran be destroyed. He is, as visibly as he possibly can, while still maintaining the fiction of toughness, laying the groundwork for a deal. There is a Wall Street Journal report citing multiple U.S. officials that Trump has privately told aides he would only consider ending the ceasefire if Iran kills American troops directly. That is his actual red line. Everything else, airports, naval bases, regional allies getting hit, is apparently within the zone of acceptable unpleasantness while talks continue. That tells you more about where this is heading than any press conference. Trump wants a deal. He has wanted a deal since the beginning. The military posture has always been the leverage, not the end state. The blockade is a negotiating tool. The strikes are a negotiating tool. And I'd be honored to meet the supreme leader is, in the language of this particular president, a very public signal to Tehran that the door is open. The question Tehran is working through is whether to believe it. There is, of course, a complication. There is always a complication. And in this case, it has a name. Axios reported this week that Trump called Netanyahu during a heated exchange over Israel's escalating military operations in Lebanon. According to two U.S. officials and a third source briefed on the call, Trump told Netanyahu he was, quote, F-ing crazy, warned him that everybody hates Israel now, and reminded him that he had personally helped keep Netanyahu out of prison. Trump later confirmed the call happened. He described it as very productive. He said he was a little bit perturbed at Netanyahu's constantly fighting with Lebanon. A little bit perturbed. Netanyahu had apparently ordered the Air Force to bomb Hezbollah strongholds in Beirut, a move that Iran had explicitly stated would cause it to suspend nuclear negotiations entirely. That is not a minor diplomatic inconvenience. That is Netanyahu, with full awareness of what he was doing, threatening to blow up the one thing Trump actually wants out of this entire conflict. And this is where the Lebanon front becomes central to everything. Hezbollah rejected the ceasefire framework announced this week. Its leader Naim Qassem called the Washington Declaration a roadmap for the annihilation of a section of the Lebanese people. The specific sticking point is that Israel refuses to withdraw from southern Lebanese territory. Hezbollah will not accept a ceasefire that leaves Israeli forces on Lebanese soil. Iran has made Lebanon a red line. Trump apparently agrees that Netanyahu's Lebanon escalation is a problem, hence the phone call, hence the F-bomb. But whether Trump will actually force Israeli withdrawal, the kind of pressure that would cost him real political capital domestically, is a very different question. He would need something to show for it. A deal with Iran that he could hold up and say, I pulled Israel back, and look what I got. Without that deal in hand, or at least very close to done, the political arithmetic does not work, and the deal is not done. One more signal worth noting, because it does not appear in most analysis of the military situation, but matters considerably. The House of Representatives this week passed a war powers resolution directing Trump to end hostilities with Iran. The vote was 215 to 208. 4 Republicans crossed the aisle: Tom Barrett, Warren Davidson, Brian Fitzpatrick, and Thomas Massie, who has been the most consistent anti-interventionist voice in this conflict since before it started. Trump responded by calling it a meaningless vote and questioned the patriotism of the 4 Republicans who voted for it, which is, of course, what you say when a vote bothers you. The resolution is, legally, largely symbolic. It cannot override a presidential veto. The Senate has not yet passed its own version, but 215 members of the House, in a chamber controlled by Trump's own party, just voted to tell him to end this war. The 4 Republicans who crossed over represent districts facing real electoral exposure in November's midterms. They are responding to constituents who are paying $5 a gallon for gas and watching food prices rise because 20% of the world's oil supply is stuck in the Persian Gulf. Representative Massey put it plainly after the vote. People are tired of this. They're tired of $5 gallon gas and $6 gallon diesel and fertilizer we can't afford to put on our fields. Trump is not on the midterm ballot. The House members are. That gap in political exposure is what produced 4 Republican defections this week, and it is the number most likely to grow if the conflict continues without a deal. So here is where things actually stand, as best as anyone can determine from outside the negotiations. Iran concluded that the previous pain distribution was unsustainable and escalated to rebalance it. Trump played the escalation down rather than up, which is the behavior of someone who has a deal as the objective. Congress just told him, symbolically but publicly, that the domestic clock is ticking. And Netanyahu is somewhere in the middle of all this, apparently still capable of nearly derailing the entire thing on any given week, held back less by principle than by a phone call that his American patron describes as productive, and others describe rather differently, a ceasefire that both sides are actively violating while simultaneously insisting it exists, a war powers vote that is legally meaningless but politically significant, a president who would be honored to meet the leader of a country he is blockading. That is the situation. Whether it resolves into a deal, a resumption of full-scale conflict, or simply continues in this particular mode of official peace and actual war, that depends on variables that are genuinely unclear, even to the people inside the room, which is, of course, how these things always work. The outcome is obvious in retrospect. At the time, everyone is improvising. I am Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines, analysis from the edge. If you found this useful, subscribe. Episode 3 is already being built. The most important stories, as it turns out, are never the ones the headlines are actually about.